Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Tensions in the Middle East are again rising sharply after the first ceasefire talks between the United States and Iran collapsed without a deal. Washington now says it will launch a naval blockade targeting ships entering or leaving Iranian ports in a move aimed at cutting off Iran's key oil revenue. The decision comes after 21 hours of marathon negotiation in Islamabad ended in a stalemate with deep disagreements remaining over Iran's nuclear program and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has already warned of strong military retaliation, raising concerns that the fragile ceasefire could quickly unravel. So the key question now is whether this latest pressure will push Tehran back to the negotiating table or bring the region closer to another confrontation. For a closer look into the current situation, we are joined in the studio by Min Jung-hun, professor of the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. A big welcome.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is Hassan Gon, visiting professor at the Institute of Middle East Studies of the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Min. So after the ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran has collapsed, Washington said it will start a naval blockade targeting ships going to and from Iranian ports. Professor, tell us more about Washington's plan and also its motive.
Yes, it is known that U.S. military will begin blockading all ships entering and exiting Iranian ports at 10 a.m. Monday in Washington time. And the U.S. military said that the blockade will be first impartially against the vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. But the U.S. military forces would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz to and from non-Iranian ports. And it is it also said that the additional information will be provided through the formal notice before the start of the blockade. And it is known that U.S. want control over the Strait of Hormuz because it needed to strengthen its bargaining power, considering that Iran has used the Strait of Hormuz as a pivotal leverage to pressure U.S. through an oil price surge and the fears of high inflation in the United States before the U.S. midterm elections in November. And as you know, the U.S. and Iran failed to reach an agreement during the peace talks of the weekend. But there's still more time before the end of a ceasefire deal, about over 10 more days. And the U.S. needed to enhance its bargaining power by reducing Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that controlling over the Strait of Hormuz would be is the most powerful way that Iran possesses in terms of pressuring U.S. To get the more favorable negotiation outcome. But after the U.S. announcements about controlling of the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran that also announced that it would not yield to U.S. threats, and therefore the tension of the Strait of Hormuz is likely to be bigger and deeper in the coming the days and weeks, but probably days. Yeah.
Right, it's very concerning indeed. Now, in response to this, Iran has warned of strong military retaliation, which is raising concerns, of course, across the globe. Professor Gon, do you think the current standoff between the two countries around the Strait of Hormuz could actually escalate into an actual military clash?
Yes, actually, I think the risk is now very serious, though I would not say it is inevitable. The key reason is that confrontation has moved from rhetoric into operational military activities now. After the talk collapsed, Washington increased the pressure around the Iranian ports, while Iran warned that any military activities on the Strait of Hormuz would be treated as violation and would be met by retaliation. So that creates a very dangerous environment in that very narrow Strait of Hormuz. Which is very highly militarized right now. And that makes Hormuz especially volatile, is that escalation there does not need a formal political decision of a full scale of war. It can begin with a limited naval incident or a mine clearing operation or misunderstand the signal at the sea. So the real danger is not necessarily an intentional full-scale war, but an unintended clash that escalates faster than either side wants, because both of them don't want a full-scale war. So I think, yes, a real military clash is possible, and the most likely trigger would be a limited maritime incident rather than a deliberate decision for all-out war.
So we'll have to look into unintentional moves too. But Professor Min, when we take a closer look into the latest threat coming from Washington, the U.S. also would face risks like higher oil prices and the danger of clashes at the sea. Do you see this naval blockade as a way to gain leverage in negotiations, or just simply raise further tensions?
Well, as you know, the issue of opening the Strait of Hormuz was one of the main agendas in the peace talks over the weekend. And for Iran, controlling the Strait of Hormuz to raise U.S. and global oil prices and threaten the world economy has become the most useful means of confronting the United States. And for the United States, since the outbreak of the war, U.S. oil prices have increased significantly, currently averaging over $4 per gallon. And this deepens the concerns of President Trump, because stabilizing prices or controlling inflation is a key priority for the upcoming midterm elections. So U.S. demands Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz as the ceasefire negotiation in the way. But Iran is well aware of the situation and is unwilling to give up the control of the Strait of Hormuz, although ceasefire negotiations are underway. So I think the Iran wanna use it as a valid bargaining tool until they achieve the negotiation outcome they want. So it is more likely that U.S. naval blockade would escalate tensions over the Strait of Hormuz in the coming days. But then, I'm not sure whether the U.S. efforts of controlling of the Strait of Hormuz would strengthen the U.S. bargaining power or just escalate tensions of the Strait of Hormuz. It depends on how the two sides would respond to their moves respectively. So we'll see what will actually happen. But it's a little different, the subject and the argument. But I want to make sure that Iran should know that if it doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz, sooner or later, they'll get the serious consequences. Until the ceasefire negotiation began, many people in South Korea, in other countries, felt sympathy for Iran. So they perceived that U.S. and Israel started the war without proper justification. So even though blockading over the Strait of Hormuz brought economic hardships, they endured and watched the situation cautiously. But the economic situation in the world have got much worse, and they will not endure the difficulties anymore. So Iran should clearly understand that if it continues to block the Strait of Hormuz for its own interest, the responsibility will fall on Iran, not the United States anymore. So I think it is like Iran is doing a very dangerous gamble against the entire world. Of course, I think that the situation Iran faces is regrettable, very sorry for Iran, but it's no longer acceptable to cause further hardship to the global economy. So Iran should take this warning seriously, and I hope that Iran will make a wise decision sooner or later.
Right, it really should consider the impact globally as well. But when we talk about, the deal, when they have to make a deal, the negotiations part, it has collapsed on the 11th. And what do you believe has actually ultimately caused the talks to have led to a collapse?
Well, it is reported that during the talks, the two sides, U.S. and Iran, discussed a wide range of tough issues, including prohibiting Iran's nuclear weapons and its control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the ceasefire deal for Lebanon, and the release of Iran's frozen assets. And it was reported that they agreed for some of their agendas, but they got the huge gaps in terms of main agendas they got. So probably I think that the two sides could not narrow down their gaps on Iran's nuclear weapons and the control of the Strait of Hormuz. And personally, I think the prohibiting Iran's nuclear weapons was the decisive factor behind the breakdown of the talks. Regarding the nuclear weapon issues, the U.S. wants to see affirmative commitment by Iran not to pursue a nuclear weapon. It was like the red line that Washington clearly emphasized over and over again, like President Trump's comment that denying Iran any pathway to nuclear arms is the core goal that he wanted to achieve in the talks with Iran. But Iran has argued that Iran would not give up. It would not give up its right to enrich uranium for peaceful and commercial purposes. So it seems that the two sides did not want to make a compromise on the issue. And J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, said that U.S. has not seen any fundamental commitment of will by Iran not to develop a nuclear weapon. So I think that the similar result came out when they talked about the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. It means that both of them, they were not ready to make a compromise. They weren't ready to take a proactive action to make a compromise. It'll take more time. But they still have about 10 days to negotiate before the ceasefire deal is over. So I expect that they will go through intense and tough negotiations for the upcoming days through the mediating roles of some other important regional countries. And they try to make a progress for the exits of the war.
Right. We'll have to look forward to that. But as our Professor Min has pointed out, the core issue, the United States, it has demanded explicit pledge from Iran to abandon nuclear weapons, but obviously Tehran has refused. Professor Gon, do you see any realistic compromise both sides could actually accept on this nuclear issue?
Yes, actually, I believe compromise is still possible, but only in a very narrow and heavily monitored form. Right now, the main problem is that two sides are defining success in very different ways. Like Washington wants a clear guarantee that Iran will not move toward nuclear weaponization, and while Tehran rejects terms that look like total surrender under pressure. So that is why maximalist settlements is very unlikely. The more realistic option would be a freeze and verify stricter monitoring, limits on enrichment and tighter oversight of nuclear activity, while the United States stops short of demanding total symbolic dismantlement of Iran's civilian nuclear program. So technically there is room for compromise, but politically it's much harder because neither side wants to appear weak. That means any workable deal would have to be narrow, gradual, and verification center rather than dramatic or comprehensive.
But at the same time, Professor Gon, some analysts say Iran was angered by the U.S. mine-clearing operation in the Strait of Hormuz during the talks. Do you think that kind of military pressure from Washington actually influenced this breakdown?
Yes, of course, I think it's likely played a role, though it's not only the only cause for that. The talks were already burdened by deep disagreements over nuclear issues, regional armed groups like Hezbollah, and Hormuz itself. So by carrying out mine-clearing operation during negotiation almost certainly worsened this atmosphere. From the U.S. perspective, this can be presented as a defensive measure to protect shipping and to faster the moving for the shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, but from Iran's perspective, it looked more like coercive diplomacy under military pressure. So that matters because negotiations are not shaped not only by proposals on the table, but by how each side understands and interprets the other's intentions. So I would say the mine-clearing operation did not single-handedly collapse the talks, but it likely reinforced Iran's mistrust and make compromise harder by suggesting that Washington was bargaining from dominance position rather than a mutual de-escalation position.
So it did play a role with other factors still weighing in as well. Now, Professor Min, shifting gears, some reports say China may have actually tried to supply air defense weapons to Iran, but Beijing, of course, has denied this. If that actually turns out to be true, how could it actually affect the U.S.-Iran situation and also the upcoming U.S.-China summit as well?
Well, as you mentioned, it's not certain, it's not clear whether China has provided air defense weapons to Iran. But if it turns out to be true, there is a possibility that it will negatively affect the relationship between U.S. and China. But personally, I think its impact will not be that serious. It's mainly because regardless of whether it is true or not, China will be cautious in giving the military help to Iran in the coming days and the weeks and the months after the media report. For China, Iran is an important partner in the Middle East, and they want to maintain the favorable relationship with the country by providing various assistance and support during the war. Meanwhile, China doesn't also want to screw up its relationship with the U.S. due to the war. As you know, China is relatively weaker in its relations with the United States. So it's China's top priority to favorably manage its relationship with the U.S. for the political and economic purposes. So it is likely that China will be cautious in providing Iran with further military support. And it is also known that China played an important role in Iran's decision to take the ceasefire deal, and such an effort was well received by Washington. So if the Iran war finds an exit and the summit meeting between U.S. and China is held in Beijing in the middle of May as scheduled, I hope, China will be able to claim the credit for the mediating role of the war and positively affect the outcome of the bilateral summit. So we will see what will actually happen in the coming weeks. And probably, but it is certain that China did play the very important role in terms of the Iran's decision in taking the ceasefire deal. It's very important and great.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look beyond this, Iran says Israel must halt its airstrikes on Lebanon as a condition for a ceasefire. But Israel has continued its attacks. Professor Gon, how do you see the Israel-Lebanon talks scheduled for the 14th unfolding? And do you think they could help ease tensions between U.S. and Iran?
Yeah, of course, I think Israel-Lebanon talks are important, but I would not overstate their effect, because from Tehran's perspective, Lebanon has become a test case for whether de-escalation is genuine or selective. So Iran has argued that a credible ceasefire cannot exclude Lebanon, while Israel continued strikes there even during the negotiations. So that naturally worsened Iranian mistrust. If the April 14th talk make progress, they could modestly improve the regional atmosphere. They may reduce tension on one important secondary front and create a small confidence building between the two countries, Iran and the US, but they are unlikely to become decisive breakthrough in the US-Iran conflict itself. The reason is very simple. The core disputes remain the nuclear issues, the Strait of Hormuz, and the sanctions and Iran's wider regional position. At best, these talks could lower the temperature. They are unlikely by themselves to unlock a broader settlements.
Mm-hmm. So developments there could have broader implications, but not really a decisive one. Now, when we look ahead, Professor Gon, how likely is it that the U.S. and Iran would return to negotiations within this remaining ceasefire period? And what conditions do you think might bring both sides to the table?
A return to negotiations before April 22nd is still possible, but I would describe it as possible rather than actually likely, because the diplomatic channels has not been fully closed, but the political and military atmosphere has clearly worsened since the failed talks. So there are three conditions needed for negotiations to resume. First of all, some stabilization around Hormuz, because active military frictions makes meaningful bargaining extremely difficult. Second, a narrow agenda, that the first talks tried to carry out too many issues at once, the nuclear file and the Hormuz and sanctions and regional fronts. So that is part of why they failed. Third, both sides need a face-saving formula, so that returning to talks does not look like a retreat under pressure. So the most realistic path is not a grand bargain, not a comprehensive plan, but it is a staged process. first maritime deconfliction and then technical nuclear understanding, like lower enrichment or so on and so on. And only later broader regional issues can be addressed. Under current conditions, that path is much more realistic than a comprehensive settlement at once.
So the window for diplomacy may be quite narrow at this point.
It's narrow, but it's still there. Yeah.
Yes, of course, it's still there. We'll have to see how it develops moving forward. Now, finally, Professor Min, if Iran ultimately rejects the final proposal from the United States, what kind of ripple effects could that have across the Middle East and the wider international community?
Well, it will be the last thing I want to deliver further today's news. It's my personal thought, but if the ceasefire negotiation do not ultimately succeed, it is expected that the world will witness another miserable Middle East war, full-scale war. If the ceasefire talks fail, the U.S. will likely consider the use of military force because it will be the only remaining option for the country. So it is highly probable that U.S. will launch military operations to capture strategic checkpoints like Karg Islands or the 7 islands over the Strait of Hormuz. And such military operations will inevitably result in U.S. military casualties, which will provide a justification within the United States for expanding the war to the full scale. Then it is highly likely that the goal of the war will change to deploying a large-scale ground force into Iran to get a regime change and Iran's absolute surrender. And but consider Iran's tough terrain and its army, huge army of nearly 1 million troops, a ground war in Iran would drag U.S. into another horrible Middle East war. It is like the gate of hell would open. So therefore, whether the ceasefire negotiations succeed or not will be a critical turning point that could completely change the course of the war. So I earnestly and sincerely hope that U.S. and Iran will succeed in reaching an agreement through concessions and compromises and bring the war to an end in the coming weeks.
Right. We'll definitely keep our fingers crossed on that. But as for now, we'll have to conclude our discussion here at this point. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Gunn as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.